And welcome to the podcast. It's the Godward Show. I'm your host, Casey. In this episode, we're going to talk about Plato's Protagoras dialogue. And I think you just looked at a few epigraphs for this video. So those from Melville, from Shakespeare, and then from Protagoras or Plato himself, man is the measure of all things. Well, I just finished reading this dialogue for the second or third time in my life, and it's quite a dense and even entangled dialogue. I'm going to try to summarize it, kind of, or at least give you a sense of its major theme, but this video is also going to be sort of a meditation on that major theme, and that might drift a bit from a strict analysis of the text. In this case, I feel quite okay with that for some reason, but I will give you my usual admonition at the outset. Read the dialogue for yourself. In fact, that's one of the major themes here, right? Don't take my word for it or anyone else's. Just as in the model of Plato's theory of forms, there is the form itself and then its earthly manifestation, so in this case, there is like the idea itself, and then there is at one remove Plato's attempt to present that idea to you. And if you get farther removed and you say, read Leostrauss or like on Plato, or listen to Robert Bartlett lecture on the Protagoras, you'll be getting into the weeds, And if you were to listen to Michael Millerman discuss what Leostrauss thinks about what Plato says Socrates said about this important idea, with no disrespect to Millerman, whom I like, or Strauss even, I think you're getting pretty far afield from the idea itself, And the same probably goes for wanting to hear me summarize the text, unless I'm secretly some kind of spiritual, philosophical midwife myself. So just be cautious about, what it is you want in a video like this, or listening to summaries of really complicated dialogues like this. Anyway, in this video, instead of providing a clear summary and commentary, really what I'm going to give you, I'm going to try to address that big theme or idea itself, almost as if it were my idea. So cutting out all Strauss's and Millerman's, and even sort of cutting out Plato himself, so to speak, to the extent that that's possible. But for what it's worth, I've also glanced at Schleiermacher's introduction to the Protagoras and listened to Robert Bartlett's lecture on it, and I've watched Jason Giorgiani talk about Strauss, and there's nothing wrong with any of this. You can watch all this stuff, maybe you even should, with one caveat. You should understand whose perspective you're reading if you're going to read commentaries. I was in a Twitter space last night talking about how the news is fake, and my claim is that it's literally fake, because it is a representation of reality that has been selected, edited, curated, and framed for us by some people, right? And what I'm saying is you should think very carefully about who the editors of the news are, and similarly about who is doing the commentary upon history and philosophy. Once you know and you've read up on who these people are, and you feel that you really understand what motivates them and what their values are, then you can probably watch it safely, I think. Although you may not feel that you gain as much then. Because it's as if you've already understood them, then you don't really need them to do the commentary on it. You can just you can intuit what they would say about it. Like say we're talking about the Supreme Court case about vaccine mandates that's surely coming, right? And you're watching CNN and listening to Jake Tapper do the reporting. Well, in that case, you could just read the text of the court transcript for yourself, and if you decide not to do that and let Jake tell you what's going on, then in some sense you're trusting Jake Tapper's judgment as your own, right? And then, in addition to the question of who is doing the punditry and commentary, you should also get clear in your mind what it is you want to know. That is, what are you trying to learn? The text says what it says. But of course, it is possible that you're a poor reader and need help understanding it, which I guess implies that beyond the text, there is a key idea, and the text itself almost is a mediator, right? That, I propose, that is, grasping the final idea there, should be kind of your chief aim or your final telos. But that, of course, like I say, is even beyond the text, and this requires pretty big brain study, I think. To use my example of the news, what is it that you want when you turn it on? What do you want when you turn the news on? If you just have some vague desire to see what's on the news, I think that's a mistake. And this is why it's so dangerous to give yourself over to believing that the news is real, that it is anything at all. It can be almost anything they want to make it on any given day, and very little of it will concern you. Okay, we've been over this on this show, so I'm going to sort of drop it. Before I get into this, I do want you to watch a clip from Robert Bartlett.
By reading a quotation that is ultimately related to my paper, although it'll take a while to get there. It's from Maimonides, The Guide of the Perplexed. Now, we've already said and explained that this doctrine of the eternity of the world can be arranged in a coherent way only through a recourse to the law of necessity, and that necessity contains a presumptuous assertion with regard to the deity. Now, my main aim this afternoon is to urge the students here, and almost everybody here is a student, maybe everybody is here is a student. I want to urge the students especially those who haven't settled on a doctrine to call their own or even a way of life, to consider sophistry. Consider sophistry as a way of life. If you judge from the extant records, there's a lot to recommend sophistry, I think. The pleasures attending comfortable wealth, for example, and fame or honor in certain circles, all of it gained with some hard work but no sweat. It's true that the reputation of sophists has had its ups and downs. Plato apparently treated them very well.
Okay, so Robert Bartlett was talking there with Harvey Mansfield, basically Straussians, about what's going on here. And if this digression, by the way, about, should we, for example, why do I cite Robert Bartlett? Well, in some sense, it's because, he's a well-known academic political philosophy guy, and he has a reputation, right? Isn't that how we always, it's like you hear people talking about someone and then you're like, oh, well, they must be good. I'm gonna look into it. But if this digression about being careful about who you trust seems irrelevant to you, or if it feels like, oh, this is just Godward going off on his own particular eccentric concern, paranoid concern. Well, consider, in fact, that this is exactly how the Protagoras itself begins. Socrates is talking with a young guy named Hippocrates. And the rumor is a famous foreigner is in town. It's interesting that he mentions, I think that Protagoras is from Abdera. And he says, and if you give him money and make friends with him, he will make you as wise as he is himself. Which is an interesting way of framing it, isn't it? As wise as he is himself. He doesn't say wise, just as wise as he is himself. Anyway, this reference to giving him money isn't something to miss. It's kind of essential. The question is, what is a sophist? It's basically one who gets paid to talk, right? Major contemporary examples include, for example, news pundits, college professors, and so on. Which is not like Socrates, I want to suggest. I think that's true. Socrates is something else. It's an important distinction. He doesn't get paid at all. Socrates, it says over and over again, is dirt poor, penniless. I don't even think he wears shoes sometimes or whatever. Now, there's something in here about how money makes you a liar. And part of me feels that. Even at the grand total of $179 a month that I'm squeezing out of my 39 patrons, it's like, what if I change my view or I say something they don't like? I'm always at risk of losing a $5 subscription here and there. You get the idea. Fortunately, I'm independently wealthy, so it doesn't matter. Anyway, Socrates says, quote, "Tell me, Hippocrates, as you are going to Protagoras, and will be paying your money to him, what is he to whom you are going? And what will he make of you?" End quote. Do you understand? He's asking the question I'm asking about trusting sources and who it is you're going to give yourself to, right? And this is the standard Socratic set piece, by the way, in dialogues about the sophists from Socrates. He always begins by asking, what is a sophist? What are they expert at? Why is this guy, Protagoras, widely respected? What do people pay him for? And what will happen to you if you listen to him? If you go to Phaedus, the sculptor, and pay him, obviously you hope to become a better sculptor by his instruction. But what's your hope in paying Protagoras? At this point, I could really go into a 45-minute digression on the sophist question based on my experience in grad school with the rhetoric people, but I think I'll just suggest that you go back and watch. I think it's going to be right here. See this? It's going to go. You should go back and watch episode 52 of this show on the Gorgias dialogue, where I lay it all out reasonably clearly, I think, and sort of go into that 45-minute digression. Today, in this video, let me just add or remind you that in Plato's mind, the distinction between a philosopher who loves the truth above all things and a sophist, who is basically just like a slick-talking grifter, is a crucially important distinction. And I agree with Plato that it's an important distinction. And if I've ever been merely a slick talker trying to make money, I repent of that. And today I recommit myself to simply trying to gain clearer understanding. But of course, even if I were a slick talking grifter, I probably would say that, wouldn't I? I would say that I was a disinterested truth seeker, right? Or else you wouldn't have a mind to listen to me in all sincerity. So there is this problem about trust and lying and, sincerity and earnestness and listening and all of this. You understand? There's been a lot of discussion about this, by the way, over the past 40 years or so. There's no doubt that it was a sort of first run at the questions that we now consider to be implicit in postmodernism. Questions of relativism and social constructionism and doubts about whether truth actually exists at all. In fact, there are tons of people in rhetoric departments and universities who will call themselves sophists now, and who even make fun of Socrates or say that he's a sophist too. Everyone is, they say, and increasingly among political philosophy thinkers, there's a cautious affiliation with sophistry. Again, listen to Robert Bartlett, who is buddies with Harvey Mansfield, as I said, and like I said, is obviously a Straussian.
Now, it hardly needs to be said that Protagoras is also an atheist, a fact he cleverly conveys, even as he speaks with apparent respect of Zeus and Hermes and the rest. Anybody who's actually unjust would be crazy to admit to that injustice, Protagoras notes.
And yeah, I mean, sorry if this feels, I'm not really sorry. I mean, it probably feels to some of you who are interested in Strauss a little aggressive or like obsessive or something. But it is in these terms that I have this kind of running, semi-serious joke meme about not entrusting your soul to Leostrauss. Do you know what this guy is? Do you understand whether his angle is good or evil? Even Strauss has said that he himself is not a philosopher, but only a political thinker and commenter upon the classics. That makes him, almost by definition, a sophist. And what do you gain, or what do you want to gain, by listening to him? What do you hope to become? What are his goals? And how does he understand the good? For example, would you be better off listening to Arvol talk about Plato than Leostrauss? And the problem with this, or reading Schleiermacher or whatever on Plato, or Emerson, or James Mill, or E.R. Dodds, or whoever, right? Frankly, once you're thinking like this, you must also ask, and why Plato even, right? Why not spending your time reading Boethius or the Upanishads or Aristotle instead? All of these questions are ultimately kind of unresolvable, but they are a symptom of the fact that we have kind of popped out of a culture and this, I'm suggesting this is what's true of like basically the Peloponnesian War period and shortly after, during Plato's lifetime in Athens, right? Is that previously these had all been kind of independent sovereign city-states, but after the origins of the Delian League, and you've heard me talk some about Logos bringing these people together to ward off the Persians or whatever, all of a sudden like polytheism starts to arise and you get pluralism, and people have to figure out like is our God the same as their God, and how are we gonna, are our values the same as theirs, and can we meaningfully merge with them, or can we just partner with them in this mutually suspicious way? And there's a lot going on here, right? I'll just leave you with Socrates' final warning to Hippocrates before they join the discussion with Protagoras. Okay, so he says, quote,
"Knowledge is the food of the soul, and we must take care, my friend, that the sophist does not deceive us when he praises what he sells, like the dealers, wholesale or retail, who sell the food of the body. For they praise indiscriminately all their goods, without knowing which are really beneficial or hurtful. Neither do the customers know, with the exception of any trainer or physician who may happen to buy of them. In like manner, those who carry about the wares of knowledge and make the round of the cities and sell or retail them to any customer who is in want of them praise them all alike. Though I should not wonder, O my friend, if many of them were really ignorant of their effect upon the soul. If, therefore, you have understanding of what is good and evil, you may safely buy knowledge of Protagoras or of anyone. But if not, then, O my friend, pause, and do not hazard your dearest interests at a game of chance.
It's so interesting. And I really hope you understand this, and I hope I'm doing it justice. I mean, do you understand that, like, think of if, like, okay, you hear, how does this happen? Like, all of a sudden one day, you're 26 or whatever, and you hear the name Leostrauss. And the people who are talking about him seem pretty smart. Of course, by the way, needless to say, it's not just Leostrauss, it's Michel Foucault and Deleuze and Plato and Godward and anybody else, right? I like to beat up on Leostrauss because I think I do think that his like cult, his followers are a little more attached to him than in most cases. And so anyway, the point is that when you first hear a guy's name like that, some supposed insightful intellectual, it's like, why are you interested in it? Is it because you trust the person who mentioned them? And if so, like, is that fair reason to trust the source itself? Like, and so, for example, when someone goes, read Leostrauss, you should read Leostrauss, it's like, well, all right, I'll take a look. You know what I mean? So then I'm going to read like Natural Right and History, and I'm going to read the one about persecution, the art of writing or whatever. And then if like after that, if I'm kind of like, okay, I kind of get it. It doesn't really feel like it's my thing. Well, like I feel like I've done my due diligence, no longer interested, right? But you'll still get, in some cases, like the disciples coming to you and going like, you don't get it yet. There's more to read. And it's like, look, that's fine. But what I'm saying is that Socrates is making this same point to the young Hippocrates, which is everybody says, go listen to Protagoras. And Socrates is saying, like, what does Protagoras really know? What is he really going to teach you? What is he going to make you, right? Okay, well, listen. Once they get into the house, I mean, so that's the setup. It's Socrates saying, be cautious. Take great care who you give or commit your soul to, right? It's like, because you're trusting that Jake Tapper will help more than he'll hurt. And as I said, or Leostrauss, or me, or E.R. Dodds, or whoever. And so it's most important that you chiefly seek the good. Seek to know the good. And once you know that, these talkers won't be able to corrupt you anymore. Anyway, once they get to the house, they get set up for the dialogue. Socrates goes over all of this stuff with Protagoras. He basically begins with Protagoras by saying, my young friend Hippocrates wants to speak with you. And then he says, quote, then Protagoras responds with an interesting thing. He says, quote, the art of the sophist is, as I believe, of great antiquity. But in ancient times, those who practiced it, fearing this odium means like hate from the public, right? Those who practiced it veiled and disguised themselves under various names. Some under that of poets, as Homer, Hesiod, and Simonides. Some of hierophants and prophets, as Orpheus and Musaeus. And some, as I observe, even under the name of gymnastic masters, like Iccus of Tarentum, or the more recently celebrated Herodicus, who is a first-rate sophist. All of them, this is Protagoras talking, all of them, as I was saying, adopted these arts as veils or disguises because they were afraid of the odium which they would incur. End quote. Now this is really interesting, especially, I guess, in a context where we're sort of loosely wondering on this channel about the Straussian fascination with deception, esoteric and cryptic writing, noble lies, Gnosticism, and so on. But then Protagoras says that he doesn't do it in this way himself. He says, is the first sophist to openly call himself a sophist and to make a living as such. He claims to be able to make Hippocrates better. And so, of course, Socrates asks, better in what? Or better in what way? Protagoras says, Hippocrates will learn to order his own house in the best manner, and he will be able to speak and act for the best in the affairs of the state. Now, Socrates rephrases the question to understand it better. He says, so you teach the art of politics, and you promise to make men good citizens? And this is the first big controversy of this dialogue. Socrates says, I doubt whether this art of politics is capable of being taught. And he cites the men of Athens as an example. He points out that they laugh off the stage any non-expert speaker when an expert is needed. Like if they're building a ship, they want to hear from a master shipbuilder, not from, anyone else, right? And if anyone pretends to know anything about shipbuilding and really doesn't, they will laugh him off the stage. But according to Socrates, when it comes to politics, all men in Athens get to have their say. It's a democracy, remember? The crystallized version of this claim a few pages later is that, quote, virtue cannot be taught. That's Socrates' kind of opening foray here. And Protagoras replies with a big myth, very hard to summarize, about Prometheus and Epimetheus, about how humans were created and the gods had to give them traits that would be strength to protect them from, being too powerful or not powerful enough or whatever. And so the gods forgot to give, they gave men the ability to make things. That was like their ability, but not political wisdom, okay? Until finally realizing that men were going to annihilate each other, they sent Hermes, the messenger god, to give men the idea that reverence and justice are the ordering principles of the city. Reverence and justice. And Protagoras argues, Zeus gave this insight to all men. And that's why the Athenians let all men participate in political discourse. So the point in this section is that every person in the city-state monitors and corrects every other person. And in this way, they all teach each other virtue. His very helpful parallel example here is language. He says Greek, or for us it would be English, I guess. Where is the teacher of Greek? And frankly, there is none, because we all teach it to each other every day, constantly, right? It's an interesting example, by the way, because we have had English teachers. I got in this big argument one time with some baby boomer English teachers, and they were saying, well, you got to teach grammar. You have to teach grammar and syntax and parts of speech and all of that stuff. In reality, you don't, of course. Like, it's very easy. Most of you probably didn't pay much attention in grammar instruction, and that is not how you know how to write a sentence or whatever. You learn from mimicry, right? So from mimesis or whatever. And he says that's basically what's happening. Every child is constantly subjected to this constant moral correction from earliest memory, Protagoras says. And in this way, collectively, virtue is taught, even though there's not a specific teacher of it. Now, he finishes this huge opening monologue. It's a big, long speech that Protagoras gives. And when he finishes it, Socrates is kind of stunned silent. But Socrates wants a clarification to the question, what is virtue? That is, what is being taught? And so he asks about the different virtues, justice, temperance, holiness, and whether these are parts of virtue or all the same. That is, do they make up the whole of virtue as the nose, eyes, and mouth make up the whole of a face? Or are they only different in the way that gold nuggets, scattered all around the world, are different, but essentially are all the same, right? Can be melted into one substance. Protagoras says that they're different. The different virtues are different like parts of a face. And Socrates disagrees. And here Socrates goes through a long demonstration of why he's right and Protagoras is wrong. Temperance and wisdom are one. They are not various for Socrates. And then there's this annoying middle interlude where they debate the terms of the debate. Should Protagoras be allowed to go off on his sweeping monologues, or should he be made to give short answers the way that Socrates likes? They reach a compromise. I mean, by the way, I will say it's extremely rare, isn't it, on YouTube, like in the blood sports, to find anybody capable of sticking to short and direct answers. The monologue seems to be very much everyone's major tool of debate, right? If I talk long enough and with enough confidence, I have this idea that nobody will be able to check me, And so sometimes you see this in these debates. It's hard to find somebody who can just go yes or no. Maybe that's why we get that meme of the guy going, no. I sometimes fantasize about trying to do a Socratic dialogue, trying to drill down onto some idea with somebody. I think maybe Schizo Rick could do it with me, but I don't know. I mean, and I wouldn't want to be the answerer, by the way, because it's not an easy thing. But anyway, they get through that, they reach a compromise. And in the next section, they go into a long analysis of a poem by Simonides and another by Pittacus. Basically, it's a struggle over a question of literary interpretation. And this is a dense part of this dialogue, and I think I do understand it. And I can understand here why some commentary might be helpful. I mean, basically, Socrates, so what happens is they examine this poem and then disagree about the meaning of certain words, actually about certain adjectives. What are they modifying? Okay, but Socrates proves sort of up to the challenge of it, but it doesn't really arrive anywhere. And I will say, as I said, it's kind of hard to understand. Probably best we just kind of skip over it. Maybe it would help to read it in the original Greek or something. I think we aren't generally able to appreciate the nuances of formal old Greek poetry or grammar, and so whatever. Anyway, they mix into this discussion questions of being and becoming, and Socrates makes some interesting points about how we can derive the meaning of the poem by looking carefully at the context. But frankly, it's pretty tedious reading the middle section there. And I believe that this, I will say this. I believe that this section does reinforce the theme of the question of authority, about who we can trust, that I opened with, that seems to dominate kind of the whole dialogue. But you have to really focus to extract that from this section about reading the poem. It's basically whose reading of the poem can we trust, right? So if Herman Melville writes Moby Dick, you can listen to me tell you what it's about, or you can go read I.A. Richards or somebody like that and prefer their interpretation of the text. I mean, okay, you get the idea? Okay. So Socrates, as I said, is a good enough sport to get through it, but he wraps up this section saying, quote, "The talk about the poets seems to me like a commonplace entertainment to which a vulgar company have recourse." And then he says, "Where the company are real gentlemen, men of education, you will see no flute girls, no dancing girls, nor harp girls, and they have no nonsense or games, but are contented with one another's conversation." End quote. And in this case, at least, I agree with him about the poetry. It was a distraction from the real meat of the conversation. So eventually they get on with the argument, or sort of rather back to the argument. Socrates reminds them where they were. He says, quote,
If I am not mistaken, the question was this: are wisdom and temperance and courage and justice and holiness 5 names of the same thing? Or has each of the names a separate underlying essence and corresponding thing having a peculiar function, no one of them being like any other of them?
So this is basically classic Platonism, by the way, where everything kind of resolves up into the good if you know how to really understand things. But Protagoras says, no, these are all parts of virtue rather than synonyms. And he also mentions that courage is sort of an outlier. And so here they begin to discuss the possibility of courage being kind of misguided, right? You know how racing into battle courageously, you think you can win, right? But what if you really can't? So you can have a mistaken belief that gives you what seems to be courage, but is that courage or is it really just stupidity based on ignorance, right? So they have to tease apart here courage and confidence and the idea of a false belief, and it all gets kind of interesting here. But then finally, with about 15 pages left in the very kind of long dialogue, Socrates finally says, after all of this foreplay, he says, quote, "Uncover your mind to me, Protagoras, and reveal your opinion about knowledge, that I may know whether you agree with the rest of the world. And he asks him that old question about whether any man, knowing right, would choose to do wrong. Now, these last pages of the dialogue really are good stuff. Socrates points out that the masses will speak of being overcome by pleasure, for example. And so, like, in the question of, and by the way, I always encourage people to think carefully about this question that Socrates brings up in numerous dialogues. Basically, the question is, do people do wrong because they don't know what's right? And he thinks yes, that's the only reason anyone does wrong. It's interesting how it contrasts with Paul in Romans 7. I always encourage people to go. I have a video on that if you want to rewind to like episode 35 or so. And put these two in dialogue with each other and think about what you think. I mean, do people do wrong because they don't know what's right, or do they do wrong knowing what's right but just sort of choosing ill on purpose? And so Socrates says, or he points out that in general, the masses, many people, and I think this is still true, most people will speak of like being overcome by pleasure or temptation or whatever, and by that process, they say they are led to do wrong. So for example, think of eating unhealthy but very tasty foods in excess, and so on. And I think convincingly here, Socrates makes the case that the normies have no other standard for themselves ultimately than pleasure and pain. And since these are, he says, interchangeable with good and evil, he says that the masses, they only tend to do wrong when they make an incorrect judgment or measurement, he says, about which is which. So we got to think of this, I guess, as like eating the whole bag of potato chips. It might feel good now, but the cost of it is going to be worse than it was good now later, right? But people think it won't be worse, and so they eat the whole thing now. And so Socrates is saying they've made an error of assessment here, or of measurement. So eventually Socrates says, quote, "Would not the art of measuring be the saving principle? Or would the power of appearance be?" So this language is a little awkward, but basically it's important that you are choosing correctly, judging when to eat and when to abstain, when to indulge yourself and when to fast, and so on, what to eat and what not to eat. And the parallel here is to his earlier point that once you have a grasp on the good, you can toy around with the Sophists. But if you are in error about the good, or have not escaped the cave yet, then it can be deadly to listen to the Sophists. Think of the advertisements on TV for Cheetos or whatever being sophistry, right? If you really understand what Cheetos are and you know how unhealthy they are for you or something, you'll only indulge very moderately. But if you're kind of persuadable and you don't have a true sense of health and goodness and like nutrition or whatever, you can be misled by that kind of rhetoric. So Socrates says, quote, "The art of measurement would do away with the effect of appearances, and showing the truth, would fain teach each soul at last to find rest in the truth, and would thus save our life." The meaning of this is actually pretty clear, I think. Don't eat very much fancy-looking birthday cake, It looks good, but it's not good. By the way, this is another takeaway from this whole thing. Plato is not some Rosicrucian cryptographer. The reading is somewhat dense, I guess, compared to like reading Harry Potter. I'll give you that, but it means what it says, generally. And just read it. Like, you don't need these commentators if you just read the dialogue. To underscore the main idea here, Socrates has another stab at it. He says, quote,
"The saving principle of our lives would be knowledge, a knowledge of measuring, when the question is one of excess and defect, and a knowledge of number, when the question is of odd and even."
In other words, birthday cake is bad for you. Okay? That's bad. But worse is ignorance, because ignorance can destroy your soul. It can even cause you to eat birthday cake, right? And it is for this reason that in Socrates' mind, all the virtues resolve up into knowledge or wisdom or the good or whatever. And that includes even courage, which he says is synonymous with wisdom, even though Protagoras argued the other way. To understand the stakes here, Socrates points out that it's not so much that the opposite of courage is cowardice, because the knowledge of that which is and is not dangerous is really what determines whether a man runs into battle or away from battle. There may be false beliefs, but ultimately Socrates says, knowledge of that which is and is not dangerous is courage, and is opposed to the ignorance of these things. Now, by this point in the argument, Protagoras is frustrated into silence. He won't even nod in agreement anymore. At one point, he says, just go on, Socrates, finish it yourself. Basically, Socrates has bested him, even as Socrates himself kind of sort of contradicted himself, or he shifted his view from the beginning, where he first said, I don't think virtue can be taught. But by the end, Socrates concludes a little differently. He says, quote,
if virtue were other than knowledge,
that is, if it were, say, courage and temperance, etc.,
as Protagoras attempted to prove, then clearly virtue cannot be taught. But if virtue is entirely knowledge, as you are seeking to show, then I cannot but suppose that virtue is capable of being taught.
End quote. So what do we learn in the midst of this kind of long dialogue? What is the major theme and conclusion? Well, at the end, I get the sense that Socrates is trying to gently reprimand Protagoras, or warn him, without disrespecting him, by the way, by showing him that the very high sort of virtue, the transcendent virtue, and look, what do I mean by that? I'm talking about the eternal capital G good, the logos, the truth, beauty, all that. These things, rather than the flavor of the month virtues keeping your lawn weed free or avoiding citing John 8 because it's mean, these kind of very contemporary versions of morality, using gender pronouns, stuff like that. Instead of all that, goodness itself, transcendent and eternal, can be taught or inculcated. But, Socrates hints, when we look at what Protagoras is teaching and how he has gained a reputation, it isn't really that he's teaching. In fact, he's mostly teaching political expediency, how to make a buck, how to gain a reputation, and so on.
That Protagoras is also an atheist, a fact he cleverly conveys, even as he speaks with apparent respect of Zeus and Hermes and the rest.
He's not exactly generating so many Achilleses and Ajaxes, okay? He's closer to a Machiavelli or like a Nietzsche or something. But of course, it's a hard teaching that Socrates is suggesting at the end. If you teach that kind of virtue, the true and eternal kind, you might not get paid so much. You might even feel the wrath of the NPR listeners who want you to talk about the flavor of the month virtues. The hint at the end of this dialogue seems to me to be that Socrates sees in Protagoras someone capable of being a philosopher who nevertheless has descended into the world of sophistry. And if you take his point about people wrongly measuring or assessing or perceiving into account, if you understand that, choosing the lesser of two goods is what Protagoras is actually doing. Because they're ignorant, because he's ignorant, right? The implication here seems to be that Protagoras, in choosing worldly success, is making an error of judgment, trading in the prospect of an eternal reward basically for some birthday cake, right? And this is what I would say my criticism of somebody like Machiavelli or a Leostrauss would be. They're chiefly political thinkers with their eye on a worldly material prize. And in that sense, they are choosing the lesser of two goods. And so it's almost as if you can either be loved by the world or by God. And you can't serve both mammon and God, right? So this is the fork in the road that I'm trying to point us to. And I think Socrates is pointing this out to Protagoras rather gently. Not to put too fine a point on it, but Protagoras is a Straussian because he's an atheist. So all there is, or a Foucauldian, you would say. So all there is in this model is power. Those of you who want some kind of, fascist to take over, or some legalist, or some imperium or monarchy to tell you what to do and to define society for you, you're all thinking like Protagoreans here. Nietzsche even says that we live in the age of Protagoras, and that our entire course in epistemology and morality has proved Protagoras right. But honestly, this kind of stuff kind of saddens me. The claim is that everyone is just out to make a reputation or a dollar, or to put his boot on someone else's face by any means necessary. We're all Machiavellians now, you know. But this makes it impossible to simply try to do something good and decent for the love of truth and your neighbors, you know. There always has to be some ulterior, lurking, second-level, deeper motivation. It can't just be that I've enjoyed reading all this stuff and I want to use technology to record my thinking and share it with people, basically for free. It must be that I want to change the course of history, to bend it in my favor politically, or to become famous, or to make a lot of money on Patreon, something, right? It must be that I'm a Machiavellian deep down, and I have an agenda that I'm trying to inflict, or whatever. Well, I do have an agenda. I'm trying to trick you into listening so carefully to a chunk of Walt Whitman that you stop what you're doing and have a good cry.
This is what you shall do. Love the earth and sun and the animals. Despise riches. Give alms to everyone that asks. Stand up for the stupid and crazy. Devote your income and labor to others. Hate tyrants. Argue not concerning God. Have patience and indulgence toward the people. Take off your hat to nothing known or unknown, or to any man or number of men. Go freely with powerful, uneducated persons, and with the young, and with the mothers of families. Read these leaves in the open air every season of every year of your life. Re-examine all you have been told at school or church or in any book. Dismiss whatever insults your own soul, and your very flesh shall be a great poem.